Whoa there, buddy pal, hold your horses! Before you crucify me for that there title, how about watching the video first? If you still think I'm a poopy head after all that, you may tell me so in the comments. So, My Hero Academia. Worldwide hit, currently racing the likes of Haikyuu and Promised Neverland for the top spots of Shonen Jump alongside One Piece. Selling bucket loads, getting the awards, the money, the attention, and being omnipresent in the modern shonen discussion. So how the fuck dare I say that this juggernaut is underrated? Well, here's the thing. Underrated does not exclusively mean that a property or thing is generally not as recognized as it maybe deserves. While that is one application of the word, it can also be used to refer to the general unawareness of the larger community regarding specific aspects and parts of a property, even if it, as a whole, is very positively regarded. And that is what I want to talk about today. I'm not saying MHA is not as successful as it should be, it's exactly as successful as it should be. I am saying that a lot of the aspects that make it as good as it is fly under people's radars. You know what I'm talking about. When this little manga does anything even remotely worrying or subpar, everyone and their mom takes to Twitter to express how the manga is dying and Horikoshi has fumbled. However, when the manga has good or even brilliant chapters or developments, everyone is silent. Hell, even the hardcore fanbase manages to sometimes completely ignore huge aspects of what makes an arc, a chapter, or a moment great. When you ask someone why they like it, often the answer will revolve around hype, or animation, or superpowers are cool. And while those are certainly factors that make it good, I can't help but feel that this is a somewhat limited outlook that ignores a vast amount of aspects that makes the series work. So, allow me, certified internet dickbag, to go through a few parts of My Hero Academia's manga and explain why I think that those are somewhat underrated and would deserve a lot more appreciation. As one of the major online buzzwords, I'm sure you've heard the term worldbuilding before, probably in combination with One Piece. But what does it mean? Well, what it doesn't mean is a purely map-like description of the world of the story. Worldbuilding isn't just here mountain, here river, here evil empire. While this sort of location establishment is absolutely a part of it, there's a lot more to it than that. Worldbuilding refers to the creation and maintenance of a spatial, societal, and temporal context within which the story takes place in. So, essentially, it's a setting and backdrop for the plot and narrative. And there seems to be this misconception that if a story takes place in our world, it automatically has bad world building because it cannot build new and interesting locations. Which is also said about MHA quite often. And this is nonsense. Yes, the spatial world building might not be as important in it as it might be in something like One Piece, but there still is a lot of work done in the more societal aspects of it. MHA doesn't just plop superpowers into today's world and roll with it. There are tangible and realistic consequences and effects of such a major change in society. Protests and philosophical problems humanity found themselves in after the emergence of quirks, different interpretations on how that emergence happened, zealous ideological groups, or even just quirk counseling programs for preschoolers. These are all indications and logical elaborations on the concept of superpowers appearing. Horikoshi very clearly invested a lot of time to make sure that there are realistic after effects of such a massive shift in the world. But if this is too much in the background for you, how about the Stain arc and the influence of All Might's disappearance? The involuntary discrimination against seemingly villainous quirks like Shinso's brainwashing? The natural unfairness of quirk distribution and the resulting issues people face while living with them? This is all part of world building because it establishes a dynamic and complex setting in which a story can take place and the various narrative beats of the story can echo through. And while some of it is a bit hidden, I consider MHA's world building to be incredibly strong, precisely because it doesn't just focus on locations and places, but rather opts to properly examine the societal and personal consequences of something as fantastical as superpowers. While Horikoshi might not spend a lot of time on establishing that there is this location and that place, there is a lot of little bits and pieces hinting towards a larger societal issue. People face discrimination, they face racism, they face problems in their daily lives as a consequence of things that are tied into the plot. And that, my friends, is called good world building. It's baffling to me how many people will say MHA only has one good villain, usually listing either Stain or Overhaul. Some others will even claim that the story has exactly 0 good villains. This again shows that there is a bit of a tendency to ignore or look over the many merits of Horikoshi's writing. While Stain and Overhaul are both great, as they both offer disturbing perspectives on both the fanatical idealism and pragmatic cruelty that can grow in such an unfair societal structure, they are by far not the only good enemies within the story. For example, while not exactly a villain and more of an antagonist, Gentle works very similar to Stain and Overhaul, highlighting a specific issue of society. In Gentle's case, he is representative of the mediocre, the unsuccessful, the average man in a world filled with the extraordinary. By no means a boring or unimaginative concept. I'd say at least. Or take characters like Twice and Spinner, who both became villains after suffering at the hands of a seemingly utopian society. These are all very nuanced and very underappreciated characters. But probably the most consistently underrated villains are All for One and Shigaraki, the former because he's bland, the latter because he's incompetent. These are especially interesting because, well, that's kind of the point of these characters. All for One is, like All Might, a relic of a past age, a symbol of a time when villainy was plain, straightforward, simple. For him then to be equally as simply evil, or as some people call it bland, makes perfect sense for his position in the story, as he's meant to juxtapose with his younger generation of villainy, where a lot of the motivations for villainous behavior have become a lot more complex. And his blandness isn't really a problem because he isn't the main villain of the story, he's only there to bookend All Might's story. As for his pupil Shigaraki, yes, he's incompetent when we first meet him. A bumbling idiot, he seems more like an enemy of the weak rather than a main antagonist. However, the brilliant thing here is that his incompetency is actively worked into his character and his journey. The first time he appears, he has no real goals, no strategy, no motivations. He's just comically evil. But where it gets interesting is that he, unlike many other villains, is meant to evolve and to grow, as he has the frightening ability to look at his failures and learn from them. So, when he later manages to convince the public that his organization is affiliated with the iconic and charismatic hero killer Stain, when he stays calm during Bakugo's imprisonment, when he outsmarts Overhaul, when he begins destabilizing society, these all feel impactful because he's slowly working himself up to become a very dangerous enemy. It is rare for a series antagonist to actively grow and develop alongside the hero, and that makes it all the more intriguing and satisfying. Think about it. How many main villains in stories start out small and become big, rather than already being a big obstacle? It's rare, and it's interesting to see this sort of approach, and Horikoshi does it very smartly by kinda paralleling Midoriya's growth with Shigaraki's. But by far the most underappreciated aspect of Horikoshi's writing has to be the actual construction of his story. Way too often do people dismiss MHA's story as meandering and pointless, when, really, there are a lot more moving pieces present than some realize. Be it the remnants of the Meta-Human Liberation Army, or the traitor plot,
which Horikoshi didn't forget, that was a fake rumor fabricated by Tumblr. Stop believing everything you read!
There are many parallel plot lines that have been built up over the years that are all probably gonna intersect and escalate in the future. For example, Gigantomachia, All for One's enormous bodyguards, may be primarily associated with the League of Villains, but he also influences Kirishima's and Gran Torino's narratives. Or for something much more recent, in last week's chapter, Horikoshi essentially brought back a character from chapter 1 to be relevant again in chapter 221. Confirming fan theories and creating a logical line between events. It's weird how One Piece gets applauded for this sort of long-term planning, yet when MHA does basically the same thing, barely anyone mentions it. I don't know how to break it to you, but all of this is indicative of a very meticulous and well-realized writing process. Or, if you want the buzzword for it, good writing. Horikoshi very clearly planned a lot of this out and has managed to create a story that touches on a lot of ideas without spreading itself too thin. He manages to cover abuse, societal exclusion, racism, generational shifts, heroism, idealism, dynamic power struggles, and genetics all in one story without segmenting it too harshly and without losing focus. And that is something that should be celebrated and appreciated. Yet way too many people just look at plot and say, oh, it's just going nowhere. Where is the big plot? Where is the big final villain? Like, have patience and read things through properly. There's a lot of stuff between the lines that can get lost if you just skim through the chapters. So I suppose now we should ask ourselves why exactly this sort of underappreciation is so common specifically for MHA. Well, for one, there is the obvious answer. Some people just don't like it. For whatever reason they may have, valid or invalid, whatever, some people just dislike it, and that dislike makes it easier to see further faults while making it harder to acknowledge more positive aspects. I wouldn't exactly call this an issue, since that's just how our interaction with media works on a baseline emotional level. I just think it's important to be honest and admit to oneself when you just can't get into a thing and will inevitably only look for the negatives. But this is something that happens with any and all stories and series. We are looking for reasons specific to MHA, and I think the most probable contender is overexposure. Between the large and vocal fan community, the copious amounts of international marketing and merchandising, and the already massive presence of superhero stories, I think it's reasonable to assume that some people have had enough of this series without even really engaging with it. Thus, this creates a perpetual cycle where people get annoyed at the series being all over the place, creating a bias, try to get into it, and don't like it due to their bias, and then go onto social media to shit-talk the series for easy retweets. While this behavior is understandable, it's also unfair because it judges the series based on external factors and biases rather than its own internal merits. It's also annoying when people try to hide this as objective criticism when quite a lot of the time it's just really your own personal bias getting in the way of actually looking at something more precisely. Though I suppose that is the reason I make videos like this, to maybe make some of you reconsider and give the story another shot. Take it from me, I think it's very much worth it to go back and look at things with a bit more of an attentive eye. So, in conclusion, yes! This video was clickbait! Ha!